Who the Wild Things Are with Ryan McGuire.
You gotta listen to your body.
Oh my God, maybe, I could get out there, I could do this.
Let's take a ride, find your wild side, real stories, see with your own eyes.
It's so beautiful.
I'm gonna have the best time out here.
I was in tears, I was like, that's the best, man.
Welcome back to Who the Wild Things Are. My name is Ryan McGuire, and I'm here to bring you conversations with the most wild folks on the planet. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. And if you enjoyed the episode, share it with a friend. Appreciate you guys. Let's get it going. Action. All right, we got Shelby Stanger here, host of Wild Ideas Worth Living with REI, and also author of Will to Wild. Congratulations. I saw that you're over a year now since your book was published, so congratulations.
Thank you. I'm retired now.
That was it.
Retired from book writing again for a little while. I think I did it, checked, on to the next.
Well, Shelby, I came across your story, your podcast, and I think there's a lot of synergies between kind of your podcast and this podcast, and the things that I'm interested in, the things that I gather you are also interested in. But before we really dive into your story, I just want to back it up maybe a little bit and give people a little bit of background on kind of your childhood and how you got into living a life full of adventure. Was it something that was instilled in you in an early age? Was it something that you were pushed into, or how did you stumble upon kind of this adventurous lifestyle?
Ryan, it's like killing me not to ask you about you and like, how did you find me? Because we didn't even talk about this. I want to know about you. It's weird to have the microphone turned back on me, so I'll try to keep it brief. And if I go long-winded, just interrupt me. But yeah, no, I didn't grow up super outdoorsy. I played soccer as a kid. I'm 44, so probably a bit older than you. And, a lot of my life was, I also ran track when I got to high school and ran cross country. But most of my life was going to like a soccer field with lines and rules or a track. And then I did that all through college. But I did discover surfing at a really young age. And so, when I was a young woman, my dad passed away suddenly of a heart attack when I was 11. And it was just like shocking. I don't know if my mom and dad were happily married, to be honest with you. So I think for her, it was like really hard, but she did remarry an amazing guy just a few years later. And I got really lucky. I have this amazing stepdad. So it wasn't like totally sad, but I did love my dad and we had a good relationship. And I learned at a young age that life is short and that you could die. Like life was not guaranteed. And I was always a pretty hyperactive kid, which is why I gravitated towards sports like soccer. And, for women, like young girls, like soccer was awesome, and it's still awesome. It's so cool to see what's happened with women's soccer today. But I found surfing, and I grew up in this town in San Diego called Cardiff by the Sea. Some people have heard of Encinitas. It's part of Encinitas. And, there's a lot of guys that surfed. There weren't a lot of women that surfed, but my mom would send me to a camp every summer, and it was a water sports camp. She was a professor at San Diego State. And so, after my father had passed away, like she just needed us to like get out of the house, and I needed to burn some energy. So in the morning you could take sailing or surfing or kayaking, or I don't even know what else they offered. But then in the afternoon you did all these things, and I would take surfing, and I just fell in love. I think in the water, like I just loved the unpredictability about the ocean. It was enough of a challenge. I was terrible at it, but like the thrill of riding a wave really, really stayed with me. And I think I was such a hyperactive kid and such a driven family that in the ocean, I was really forced to slow down. And I started learning lessons in the water that I could never learn on land or even in like a therapist's office or anywhere else. And that never left me. I always wanted to just be a surfer, but there was no path to becoming like a surfer. There was no surf team. Like there was no, like today it's so cool for young girls. Like if I could, if I could be a little girl today, I mean, I'm so stoked for them. But you go down to the local beach in San Diego, and there are a ton of little girls, and they're ripping, and they're like buddies with each other, and they are confident young women, and it's really cool
Mm.
to see.
Yeah, it is amazing how far the youth surfing scene has come. Like just in the last couple of years in time I've spent in Southern California, it seems like it has gotten like super legit, and there's a lot more opportunities for little boys, little girls.
For
Um,
everybody, you're right. Little boys too.
yeah,
Like,
everybody.
so good for
It's
them.
just surfing, and I think about this in with snowboarding too. Um, they're only one like, well, surfing started kind of like the 1950s, as I understand it. The only history I know of surfing is from a book called Cocaine and Surfing. Have you ever read that book?
Is it Chaz Smith's book? It's really good if it is.
I think,
Yes.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think that is, yeah. It's like the black and white cover. Such a crazy
Yep.
book.
He also
But
wrote a book called Welcome to Paradise, Now Go to Hell. I think that book is better, so you should read his book. He's a
Really,
good writer. Yeah.
is it something? I mean, just from what I gather, so for folks that don't surf, I'm gathering that this is about surf culture.
Yeah, it's about like the dirty side of surf culture, but he's kind of a snarky, funny writer. He's actually a
Right.
really nice, lovable guy, but his shtick is that he's just funny. It's just a different. If you love adventure, you'll like this book because it's the other side of adventure and the surf industry and the craziness that happened in it. It's a little bit about Hawaiian culture and some parts of it. I don't want to give it
Yeah,
away. It's a good book. But
it
yeah,
is
surfing
interesting.
is not surfing is old if like, you want to say like Hawaiian surf and there's some we don't know 100%, but there's images that, Hawaiians and other cultures have surfed for much longer. But really as we know it today, it's not that old.
Exactly. Yeah, and
Like
I think the same
snowboarding,
could be,
exactly.
yeah, the same could be said about snowboarding. Um, but like in the modern commercialized version of it, it's only a couple generations old, so there's still, each generation to come, there's leaps and bounds that happens in it versus maybe a more established sport like soccer. It's like the game, the accessibility, the strategy, the training, a lot of that is pretty well known and sorted out at this point.
But to me, the biggest difference between those two sports was the nature. Like,
Mm,
soccer was a predictable surface that you played on with teammates. And also, you had other people that you had to depend on. In my case, I was a goalkeeper. So I was either the hero or like the idiot who like got nutmegged or chipped. And I'm 5'4", so I got chipped a lot. I could save the ball like far right corner, but I was like ADD and dreaming about boys and surfing half the time. So I got chipped, probably got nutmegged. But in surfing, I think there's so much ability to experience awe, just like in snowboarding, because you're out
mm,
inside in nature and no wave is the same. And you might see like a dolphin pop up or a stingray, or in California, we have Garibaldi, which are these like, beautiful orange fish. And so there's a lot of elements for surprise. And I think today, when we grew up as kids, I didn't, there wasn't phones, there wasn't Instagram. So there was a lot of opportunities for surprise. But I think today there's not a lot of opportunities for surprise. Like we kind of
mm.
know when we go on a trip what it's going to look like. But I still think like in nature, you have that element of mystery. And that's really
Mm.
important.
Yeah, I used to have this saying with my friends because when I started, excuse me, when I started surfing, I learned at Ocean Beach, not the Ocean Beach in San Diego, but in
Oh, in
San
San
Francisco.
Francisco, where it's big and scary and cold.
Terrifying, unrelenting, and really short period waves. And I was on a big foamy, so I was like just getting absolutely ruined every day and just like never catching a wave, had no idea what I was doing. But I used to always say to my friends, like, the worst day surfing is like the best day anywhere else. Cause like, sure, I didn't catch a lot of waves and I was absolutely terrible. But I did get to like lay on a board in the ocean, seeing porpoises or, yeah, like seeing the city like I had never seen it, or seeing cool rock formations out in the water, and just really exploring from a different perspective.
Yeah, you hit on two things. Like one, you're in nature, you're seeing it from a different perspective and you're forced to slow down. But also sports like surfing, like rock climbing, kind of like snowboarding, probably skiing is you fail a lot. And you fail enough times that then you keep trying and eventually you try more and you succeed and the failing you become more accepting of it. And as a little kid, that's such a good lesson. Like we are in such a time of high achieving and doing, and I think that failure is really overrated, but like these sports force us to fail. Like in surfing, you suck, but you still have fun doing it. You're playing. That's the other thing about it is they're like so fun. They make you play. Where
It's that, and the
soccer,
other
like
thing
you can
about
fail.
the other thing I think about with surfing is that it's pretty much you can infinitely scale the fear. So when you start surfing, hopefully you don't start at Ocean Beach. Hopefully you start somewhere with like 3-foot rollers and you're on a longboard and you're catching whitewash, and then you graduate to riding the actual face of the wave. And then you get comfortable there and you're like, this is no longer scary. So then, you might go to head high waves or double overhead, and the waves can just keep growing to an infinitely scary level to the point where people are riding 100-foot waves. And metaphorically or maybe literally, you're going to shit your pants every single time. Like the thing with other sports is like, once you've kind of seen it, like you're saying, like it's no longer as scary, right? That fear can no longer expand at the same rate over time.
That's
Like,
really interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought about it like that, but you're absolutely right.
I will never ride a 100-foot wave.
Me neither.
Period.
I don't even really like waves like much over my head, to be honest,
neither.
anymore. I'm like just happy to enjoy nature at head high or less. And I'm happy.
And that's okay. So outside of the surfing lifestyle that you've pursued, it seems like you were kind of interweaving it with this journalism career, but it wasn't like your prototypical journalism career. It was sort of a journey that was focused on melding it with your passion. So talk to us a little bit about kind of getting your first big break in journalism that also related to the adventure, the outdoors. What did that first job look like for you?
I guess I had two jobs, I think, that really, like, actually three. So when I was young, I went to college for journalism in Atlanta, Georgia at Emory University. They had this great journalism program that they don't have today. But as part of the program, you got to go optionally to South Africa and work as a journalist. And all of my classmates were covering like really crazy stuff. They were covering AIDS, they were covering racism. Apartheid had only ended a few years prior. And I told my professor I wanted to cover surfing. And he was just like, at first he was like kind of annoyed at me. And then he's like, okay. And so the first day of the internship, every single person had to like file papers in the newsroom. And I had emailed the people in South Africa ahead of time telling them I wanted to cover surfing, that I was interested in adventure. And they sent me with this photographer on a boat in the middle of this wild ocean in Africa, covering the second year of this event called Big Wave Africa, which is like still in existence. And it was incredible. I mean, there was a female jet ski driver. So there were so many stories there. There was like one of the only black surfers in Africa who was surfing. So there was a race story there. So what I learned really early during my time at Emory while working as a journalist in South Africa is that I could cover the same stories my classmates were covering, racism, post-apartheid, politics, etc. But to me, I related to it better if I covered it through the lens of adventure sports. I guess back up 1 year prior, so my freshman year of college, I got into the journalism program, and we had this wild professor. He wrote for Esquire. First day of class, he brought in this guy who had like gold chains and just looked like he was straight out of the mafia, which he was. And he said, I want you to write about him. And like, he was such a good professor. He yelled at us because some of us missed the fact that he was wearing this like crazy gold big cross on his neck. And he's like, that should have been one of the first things you wrote about. Anyways, he said, hey, the best advice I can give you guys is go home to your local newspaper and try to get an internship. And I was like, okay. And so I skateboarded over to my local newspaper, talked myself into an internship. They said yes. I couldn't believe it. And they let me start writing articles for the newspaper. When I got comfortable after writing 1 or 2 stories about City Hall, which was like mind-numbing and boring, I was like, can we just do a surfing and adventure column? And they were like, I don't know, Shelby. Anyways, I gave them some story ideas. I started writing stories. I wrote a surfing story. And the next week I came into the paper. I was 19 years old and they're like, Shelby, you have a really big error on page A3. And I was like terrified and they were laughing at me. So I was like, I don't know what this error is, but they had basically put my picture over my story and gave me what basically was the impetus for what I do today, an adventure column. And I was writing stories about surfers and adventurers. And I ended up covering like 2 twin old ladies who biked across the United States. I covered a guy who surfed the most amount of days in a row. And I don't know, I was just always fascinated by these people who took this untraditional route in life, but used adventure as a catalyst to do that. And so I worked for very little money as an intern at 19, went to South Africa at 20, interned at CNN the next year. And I just kept pursuing job after job that would allow me to write, but kind of about adventure. And I really tried. Like, I tried to pitch the LA Times. I tried to pitch CNN to cover adventure. And at the time, around the early 2000s, this job didn't exist. Like, the X Games were just starting out. And so someone advised me, hey, if you want to cover adventure journalism, there's nothing like this that exists full time, but you can go work for Vans in marketing. And I ended up meeting with the people at Vans and I stayed in touch. For a summer, I did a journalism job with Vans, covering a punk rock concert tour called the Vans Warped Tour, which was a great first job out of college. And then later I went into marketing and it was a great job, but it wasn't journalism. And so in 2009, I'd worked for Vans for 5 years. I had this cushy job. I was moving my way up the corporate ladder, but I wasn't really doing adventure journalism. I was doing adventure marketing and I loved it. And I loved Vans and I loved the people I worked with, but I wanted to tell stories of other people. And I really didn't like commuting to work an hour each way every day. I really wanted to work from home. And at the time that just like wasn't an option. I probably would have stayed if it was because I liked the job that much. But it was torturing me and not doing what I really wanted to do and kind of settling for this other path that was very stable and lucrative tortured me. And my parents said I was crazy for trying to quit. My sisters thought I was stupid. My friends told me I was an idiot. I had this like dream job at Vans at the time, and I kind of spiraled into a little bit of a depression. And it took me a while to get out of it. And eventually I just had to make the decision that I was going to quit and try freelance journalism as an entity, which never really turned out to be lucrative enough to sustain myself. I always had to do other jobs while doing it. But it was pretty fulfilling. I definitely made it happen in 2009. And I'd say the third story that really helped me ignite that part of my journalism career is while I was at Vans doing marketing from 2003 or 4 to 2009, I started freelancing for surf magazines, for stand-up paddle magazines, for canoe and kayak magazines. They paid like crap. They paid like $200 an article and you would work all weekend on them. And then a friend was like, hey, I need to pitch story ideas to Outside Magazine. They're looking for real athletes who have done incredible feats but are not sponsored. Today, these athletes are just called influencers. Like there's tons of people that aren't competitive athletes that are sponsored and it's amazing. At the time that didn't exist. And I gave Outside, I was like, I'm not going to give you these ideas. I'm going to send them directly to Outside Magazine. So I sent Outside Magazine 20 of these ideas and they took one and it was like 100-word article. in Outside Magazine. And I knew if I had had a clip in Outside Magazine, I could quit my job at Vans and pursue adventure journalism full time. I thought it would be more lucrative than it was. It never was. But I ended up making it work by having a million other jobs. And yeah, eventually I started a podcast, and that's where I'm at today.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about, obviously there was the shift for a lot of journalists between kind of conventional journalism moving into podcasting. I don't think everybody took that route, but I think quite a few people did. So talk to me about what that looked like for you, and maybe a surprise along the way that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, so in 2009, I was trying to be a magazine journalist, which, like, they were starting to get smaller and smaller, but they were still pretty hot in 2009. And then I quickly realized after a couple of years of doing that, that wasn't going to work. And I met a woman who had started a website that covered the business of the outdoor and action sports industry. And I met her at an event that was held at the Vans office. I still had a relationship with Vans, and I highly recommend anybody who quits their job to like leave on good terms and stay friends with people, because those relationships I've made over the years have paid back in countless ways. So yeah, I met this woman and I talked myself, or she liked me, and she hired me to be her reporter. And that was really helpful, because doing that job, I ended up going to all of the trade shows like ASR, Action Sports Retail Show, Outdoor Retailer, etc. And I started meeting a lot of people in the industry and building my, oh my God, I'm going to sound old, Rolodex, building my own contact list of contacts that were important and influential. What was the question? I did like 3 podcasts this morning. I'm so sorry. I'm tired. You're asking how I got to the podcast. Okay, wait. So then, so I had this so my job there was to write about the business of the industry, and I learned a lot about business. I had been toying with the idea of going to business school, didn't want to spend the money, but I was interviewing people who started businesses all day long. And around 2016, I'd written a story about Wim Hof for Outside Magazine, and I interviewed Wim, and he was so amazing. And this was an early Wim Hof story, the Breath Man, the Iceman. And they edited it in a way that made him sound smarmy. And Wim had told me so much great information. I wished that interview had lived in full form, like somewhere in the world. And someone was like, duh, like podcasts, that's your answer. And I loved listening to Tim Ferriss, but I'd wished he was a woman or interviewed more women. And I wish he'd interviewed more adventures. He'd done one with Alex Honnold, and I thought it was so great. I was like, oh my God, a whole podcast about that would be amazing. And someone said, Shelby, take a strengths finder test. I was really lost. Like, if any of you are lost, I highly recommend taking some sort of skills test that shows you where your strengths are, and then figuring out how you can marry your skills with something that someone will actually pay you to do. Because I'm good at talking, but I didn't know someone would pay me to talk. I really love surfing, which is something you also need to figure out what you love to do, but no one is going to pay me to surf. I also love just walking around and frolicking, but nobody wants to pay me to just take pictures of myself and be an influencer. Podcasting is what I landed on. And this idea for starting a podcast kind of like simmered in the back of my brain for a couple of months. And finally I was like, I'm going to do this. And when I decided to start a podcast about adventure, there wasn't really many around. There was Dirtbag Diaries, and there was She Explores, which I didn't find out about until after I started my podcast, but they only catered to women. And I didn't know of anybody else. And so I was like, cool, I'm going to start a podcast for men and women, hosted by women, about action and outdoor sports. Because Dirtbag Diaries was pretty much just outdoor sports. And I wanted surfing and skateboarding. So yeah, I took a business accelerator course and wrote a business plan on the first day as if the podcast was my business. And then 3 months later, I had to launch my business, which meant I had 3 months to launch a physical podcast with 3 shows. And it was awesome.
That's amazing. It's cool how that intentionality came before the podcast. You kind of set it up with that course. I think when I was getting into podcasting, I was just like, yeah, I think I'm just gonna start a podcast next week and just
Well,
see what happens.
That's okay that you did that. Like, I was really lost and I like tried a lot of things. I mean, I've had like a million jobs. I mean, I think at one point I was getting desperate for money and someone convinced me to like do MLM marketing for a vitamin company. Like, it always sounds really good on paper. Like your friend is making all this money and living in Costa Rica, and all you have to do is like sell these vitamins and lotions and potions to people. I was terrible at it. I lost money. I was like left with all these samples. I'm like, okay, I'm not meant to do this. So I tried a lot of things, and then this one thing, podcasting, just like kept coming back to me. I was like, I loved journalism. I honestly hated sitting at my desk and writing stories on deadline. It was always so stressful. I was always like, well, why can't the interview that we had just like live as the interview? And that didn't even exist when I was a little kid. So I think the most surprising part that you had asked me to your original question was like, I didn't know that just talking and having a conversation could be the journalism. Like,
Right.
I wasn't going to have to transcribe a story and then write it and then make this amazing lead. Like, look, when we write scripts, the way my podcast or REI's podcast now is, you know, there's a team, we write a script, we try to build a lead in there. There's still writing and journalism, but podcasting as a whole is just a conversation. And I really like that.
Yeah, I think it's the most unlikely thing that we could have expected, and it just comes back to human nature. I think everyone pretty much could see that social media was getting shorter and shorter. It wasn't hard to predict TikTok or Reels or Vine or any of that. It just made sense, right? Like quick videos that get a message across in 30 seconds, right? That was where things were going. I don't think if you would have told somebody in 2002, we're going to have a show, or the top 5 shows in America are going to be things where 2 people just drone on for 2.5, 3 hours, and they're going to be more successful than Fox News, I think everybody would have told you you're out of your mind. That doesn't make any sense. Everyone's going to hate that. Nobody will listen to that. And it just comes back to the fact that as humans, we're just storytellers, and we just want to sit around a fire and hear people talk candidly. There's something comforting about it, and it's the only place where you have to be authentic. You can only keep up this facade of who you are for, you know, the 30-second or minute-long clip. You know, when you get in a podcast, you're going to get to know somebody within a pretty short period of time, and who they are is going to come out in its most authentic form.
It's so funny. Like, I've interviewed enough people right now that I know if they're lying or they're bullshitting me or there's like another layer to their story. And I'm always like, you know, with adventures, most of us have another layer to us. Like, there's a reason we're sailing across an ocean and not like that scared about it. Or we're hiking like the Pacific Crest Trail and then we're going to do the Appalachian Trail. I mean, there's something motivating us from like our childhood or something else. So I found that adventures especially are intuitive, sensitive, curious people that really want to live and experience life, but a lot of them have had to like walk through darkness to get there.
Okay, so you set me up for that one. Shelby, what is underneath that has led you to pursue these grand adventures?
Well, let's just be honest. I'm not like a grand adventurer as the guests I've interviewed. I've done very small adventures and they're really meaningful for me. But yeah, like I have some darkness. Like when I was a little kid, my dad died suddenly. There was addiction in our family. And I've always, you know, my mom, I'm really lucky. Like, she's a total survivor. There was also a kid that was born before me, but after my sisters. So I'm the 4th kid, and he died at like 3 months of sudden infant death syndrome. And so I think there was a lot of anxiety when I was born. Like, was I going to die? And so I asked my mom really recently. I was like, Mom, I don't understand. Like, I'm so brave about doing things. Like, I will quit my job. I will go surfing. I will go to Indonesia. I'll date this person and ask them out. I'm not afraid of that stuff. But like, I'm terrified of little decisions. And she was like, you know, I think you grew up around a lot of anxiety that, you know, you just kind of absorbed. And I was like, okay, but you can't blame your parents for your problems. Like, you gotta like move past that. But I think I've always been really sensitive to the fact that life is fragile. One, from being born after someone who died, and two, having lost, a father at a really young age. And so that's probably where it comes from. And I'm not going to lie and say addiction doesn't run in my family. There are some members of my family who've struggled with addiction. And, for me, I drink one beer and I'm like pretty buzzed, and I don't like love the feeling of being out of control of my body. So I'm pretty lucky that way. But I think nature has taught me. I also come from a really driven family, and I think there's probably a lot of your listeners that are high achievers, they're runners or ultra runners, and they probably come from like achieving families. And nature has really taught me to like slow down and kind of to measure what matters, because nature really doesn't care what your grades are or how much money is in your bank account or what book you wrote or how many accomplishments you have or what you even look like. And so that's been really good for me as well.
Yeah, you touched on a couple things there. One of them is sort of the memento mori attitude, right? Like remembering that you too shall die. And I think that's a undertone for a lot of people who kind of front load their life, right? The individuals who it's like, wow, that guy's doing a lot. Like we've both had him on the podcast. You're like, wow, this guy is doing a lot. And I think oftentimes, I don't want to say always, but I think oftentimes part of that is because they feel like there's a clock on, right? And they understand that this thing is moving rapidly and it's not interested in your existence long term, right? Like we came from the dirt, we're going back to the dirt, and individuals that understand that tend to live with like a little bit more veracity, it seems like. The other thing that I think that you nailed on, and it's funny because I don't surf as much now, only maybe once or twice a year when I go to the coast, but we used to always have a saying like waves don't care. Like the wave doesn't care if you're drowning, like if your shoulder popped out of place like while you were trying to paddle, like waves don't care, they're going to come and smash you. Like doesn't make a difference. And you can say that for all pieces of nature. And in my work, I take a lot of high achievers out into the bush, and the effect it has on them is typically, I don't want to say always, but it's typically life-changing. Like the way, because it's impossible to hit those RPMs when all of this is around the computers and the screens and the human influence. But once you strip everything away, you have no phone, no watch, no way of telling what time it is. Oftentimes alone in the wilderness, just with your own thoughts, your brain like completely slows down and you hit like different RPMs that you've never hit before. And you realize very quickly that all of those things you were worrying about, they're not as significant as your ego made them to be.
Oh yeah, I bet you that must be so interesting, taking businessmen into the bush. Like I actually got taken into the bush by a guy who was on the show Alone, and he took my partner and I and a couple
What's
of
his
other
name?
people. Joel Vanderloon. He was on
Okay. Yeah,
season 7 of Alone, and
we
he
have a
had him
lot
on.
of mutual connections, Joel and I. I
Oh,
don't know him personally, but we
he'd
have a
be
lot of
he'd be
mutual
good on
connections.
the podcast. He's super fun. I knew him as a friend before he was doing any of this stuff. But I quickly realized what a big baby I was out in the wild. But kind of back to what you said, like there are these people that feel like a clock is running. And I've had that on me a lot. And I don't think it's always healthy. Like we have a lot of time and we have a limited amount of time. Like both and can be true. I used to live my life by buts. And I think whenever I say yes, but, or I have to do this, the clock is ticking, but, that's kind of like the ego. I'm trying to live more with like, yes, and like two things can be true. We have a limited amount of time, and like we also have a lot of time so we can chill out a little bit.
I'm curious with you, because you interview so many people and have this amazing podcast, are there any recent conversations that have like stopped you in your tracks? Like
Yes.
when you talk to that individual, it changed the way you think on a daily basis.
I think it's happened a few times, and it's obvious people, like really high level achieving athletes, like Bethany Hamilton, fascinating young woman. I spent some time with her. She's a woman who lost her arm to a tiger shark when she was 13, but like she's a mom to like four awesome kids. She surfed Jaws, and I was with her when that happened. More with her, spending time with her when she was on my podcast. It was really early and the sound was bad, but Alex Honnold, like every time I've chatted with him, he's just been incredible. There was someone this year that I talked to that was like really high level that really stuck with me, but most recently it's been older women. So I recently had on a marathon swimmer, and this podcast isn't out yet, but she is in her 70s, like late 70s, and she does all the channel crossings. So like the English Channel, the Catalina Channel, like the North, whatever. She's done them all. And these are distances of like 20 plus miles swimming in the open ocean. You're fed only, you can't touch anybody when you're eating or swimming. Someone has to feed you like with a bottle, whatever. So I asked her like straight up, and I was like, how do you deal? So, and she also didn't start swimming seriously until age 55. So I
Whoa.
asked her like three questions really stuck out and like just changed like kind of a lot of things of the current situation on its head. I said, how do you stay up at night when you're doing these crossings? Because you're crossing through the middle of the night. And she's like, well, I was a night nurse and I had babies. So like I'm used to staying up in the middle of the night with my kids. And I have grandkids now. And I was like, oh, that's so cute. Of course. Like you're a nurse, you're a mom, you can just stay up at night. Like I don't know how to literally stay up for 24 hours. I'm like so impressed by people who can. I can't do it. Then I asked her, like, how do you cross train? Like, what do you do when you're not swimming? And she's like, oh, I have a beautiful garden and I keep bees. And I was like, oh my God, of course you do. So she's not going to the weight room. She's not like training with a personal trainer, doing all these ridiculous stuff. And then here's the kicker. I'm like, well, what are you eating on these swims? Like, what did you have? Smoothies? Do you have gels? Do you have a favorite bar? And she's like, oh, no, 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 honey. She's like, I have a maple tree in my backyard. I tap it and I drink maple syrup with water, and that is all I will ever put in my body. And I just laughed because like we make it so complicated. Like all of us think we need these bars and these gels and these like gear, like the best gear, and like we don't need anything. There's a 70-something-year-old woman who has 8 Guinness records crossing major channels, and she's crushing it. And she's literally like beekeeping, gardening, and drinking maple syrup. And like to me, she was like the most impressive interview I've had all year, and I like loved her. I'd have to go through my podcast to kind of go through who else like really stopped me in my tracks, but it's usually older people that are like women that usually get me. And in fact, one of the oldest people I ever interviewed was a Holocaust survivor. Her name is Edith Eger, and at the time I interviewed her, she was 91, and she had just written her first or second book, and like she just had a perspective about life that was really beautiful. And really it was that like, listen, we all have a choice. And the key to that choice is just in our pocket. We make it complicated. You know, we can choose to hate our oppressor. Like she could just have so much hate in her life. Like she was held captive in Auschwitz. They killed her parents. Her and her sisters made it out. And instead, she's chosen to forgive and share her knowledge with other people. So yeah.
Wow.
So basically the lady who survived Auschwitz and the lady who just taps her maple tree, they're both grandmas. And I found them to be two of the most interesting people on the podcast.
Those are powerful stories. I've noticed an undertone in a lot of your achievements, your podcast, things like that, that the focus on women is very important to you. And I'm curious where that comes from. Do you think it's because you grew up with your mom and you lost your dad early and like you kind of had this really strong figurehead? Is it coming from a spot where maybe access for adventure and sports was harder for women? Where do you think that comes from?
I think I was just lucky. Like I grew up around like really strong women. So like my mom is just this total badass, but she wasn't always badass. Like before my father passed away, I don't think she was that much of a badass. She told me she had wanted to leave him and she was too scared. And that was really interesting. And after, like, you know, she had gone back to school at age 50 to get her doctorate. Like, she's 77 years old today, and she's like flying across the country, speaking and doing interventions. And like, she rode a horse and did a cold plunge yesterday. I'm like, go mom, you know, and she's 77. So having a strong mom, I also have two older sisters. They both are entrepreneurs. They're total badasses. And, you know, the first woman surf instructor I had, like, I had never seen a woman that looked like that. I had these two really hot young male surf instructors, and I had the biggest crush on them, and they were so cool, but they basically would be like, okay, go paddle out, and then they'd go surf and catch their own waves, and they'd like every now and then give me tips. And that's just how it was. And then I had another woman instructor that I just like didn't relate to. And then I had this woman named Izzy, and she was really pretty. All the guys liked her. She spoke fluent French and Spanish. She taught SAT classes, which my mom was like awesome. And I guess I could see myself in her. And I think it's really important to like see someone like, I get that like a lot of us are over like this representation stuff, but seriously, like when you see someone who looks like you, it's just like being a little kid on the playground. And when you see that little kid do the swing or like climb to the top of the pole and he's also a kid, you're like, oh, well, he's a kid and he did it. I can do it too. So for me, seeing another woman surf was really big. And most of my life, I have been the only girl. Like I played on a soccer team with mostly boys as a little kid. So yeah, I guess that's where it comes from. Like one, being from this strong family of women, and I'm not going to lie, like being a girl has also allowed me to have some pretty amazing jobs. Like I would not have become the women's marketing manager at Vans at a very young age if I was a guy. Like they 100% hired me because I was a girl that could kind of skateboard, even though I pushed Mongo, and could kind of surf, you know? And I had a really good educational background and I could present myself. So I don't know, I guess I'm just a girl and I'm a woman, and I thought this was, I played on a lot of women's sports teams, but when I started Wild Ideas Worth Living, I never wanted to play the girl card. I wanted the show, you know, I thought only women would listen, but what I learned was that as many men listen too. And I think, you know, I really like men. And so I think it's important to also showcase like both, you know, men and women and people of all colors and types, like, and all abilities going out and doing the thing. Like to me, it's not so much their identity that I'm interested in. I'm always just more interested in their idea. Like what's their wild idea? And then who they are is just like, oh, cool.
Yeah, I love that. And you have this balance to strike. You were kind of downplaying yourself in your own adventures, but you're someone
not
that's
like going to the bush like you and like I'm going to
everyone's
go,
adventures are different.
I just went to Mammoth Mountain and I stayed in a really nice cabin at the end of the day. And we were hardcore during the day. We did a couple of big hikes and went in some cold lakes, and it was super fun. But I like to shower. I like water.
That's fine.
Dirty
but
feet.
You also quit your job and moved to Costa Rica to be a surf instructor. I think a lot of people would say that that's a pretty gnarly, crazy thing to do.
It was so bananas. My parents were like, really? I sent you to Emory so you could go be a surf instructor in Costa Rica? And it was the best thing I've ever done. And if you're listening to this podcast and you want to network with really interesting people, go be a guide, like, and teach executives and businessmen like you how to surf, how to do bush work, how to go down a river, how to hike, how to mountain bike, because that's like better networking than you'll ever do in a conference room. You literally get to change their life, and they will repay that favor tenfold and give you ideas. Like I literally taught this guy how to surf who was the president of NPR. And he's like, Shelby, you should start a radio show about adventure. And I kept in touch with him, and he's like, no, timing's not right. It was like at the Obama election time when I had pitched him. He's like, can't do it till after the election. nothing ever happened with him, but he gave me the idea to start a radio show, which made me think of podcasting. I never thought about audio storytelling until that moment, but he'd been one of my surf students.
Wow, that's beautiful. And
Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember exactly that sentence you just said, but it was almost perfect what he said to you. It was like almost exactly what you started.
Said you should start a radio show about adventure. Yeah, crazy. But
Nailed it.
literally, like I'm at a crossroads right now in life. Like my podcast is now owned by REI, which is amazing, and it's great. And I'm trying to figure out my next chapter. I'm not totally sure what that looks like.
So I want to run through that real quick. Give us just like a little bit of this podcast saga. What did it look like when you started it? Like we heard, okay, you did the business plan, you got it going, you had some episodes. And then at some point, this thing starts to grow and you sell it to REI?
So it's a little bit of a longer story than that. So when I started the podcast, I really had REI as a brand in mind. I love REI. It's where I got gear when I was 16 years old and lived in Costa Rica for a month, building a fence for a kindergarten. And that whole experience changed my life. REI is literally where I got the gear to like paddle down a remote portion of the Amazon River, to do all these things. Like gear is this like this little middleman between like you and the adventure that you go do. Like you don't need great gear, but you need gear that works. And sometimes just having gear is the thing that gets you from point A to B. So I always had REI in mind. And when I started the podcast, someone had advised me that REI was doing this campaign called Force of Nature, and they were trying to cater to women in the outdoors, and I should hit them up to try to subsidize my podcast. And I did. I found the right person to talk to, pitched them, and they were basically like, great, Shelby, you sound nice, like, stay in touch. We are not in the podcast business. And I was like so bummed. I literally thought it would have been a slam dunk. And by the way, I have become pretty good at pitching because as a journalist that's freelance, you have to pitch and sell your stories or you starve. And so that was a skill that I had worked really hard on, and I couldn't believe I got rejected. Another thing you have to learn in adventure and in business is that you can't take rejection personally. Sometimes a no is just like not now. It's like dating. Like sometimes the timing's just off. So I went ahead and got other sponsors to help me pay for the production of my podcast. Because unlike you, I'm not techie. Like I didn't want to edit my podcast. I didn't know what I was doing. So I immediately outsourced that. Well, whatever. You're probably better than me. So I outsourced all that, but I needed a way to pay for it because I'm cheap. And I was like, I don't want to pay for it. So I hit up these brands. Remember in the beginning, I said I had been a business journalist. I had made some contacts. I hit up every brand I knew and I pitched them until I was my husband. So I was basically doing PR jobs on the side to pay for my podcast. And my partner, he was just like, why don't you spend that time, since you don't really love doing PR, why don't you spend that time pitching other companies to pay you to do your podcast and sell advertisements, and don't complain to me until you've pitched 100 people. So I just got busy. So I had it funded by other people. And then a couple months later, I went back to REI and said, hey, I'm interested. I did this podcast is growing. Are you interested? And we had a conversation and they got involved as a licensee of the podcast. And then in 2020, they decided that they wanted to be a part of the podcast in a bigger way. And when I wrote my business plan, I wrote, my goal is to sell this to REI in 5 years. And I didn't really think that would happen. So that was a really nice surprise. But the bigger goal was that I want other people to use this podcast as inspiration to get outside and use nature as a catalyst to heal and change their lives. And I couldn't think of a better partner than REI. I had no social media following. No one really knew who I was. Yes, I had journalism credentials and some marketing credentials and sales credentials, but like I had like 200 followers on Instagram. And so I thought REI could help get more people outside than I could. And so it's their show. And to be honest, like I have an awesome team. They have the original production company that I worked with runs their show. They have some amazing people at the brand, and they've brought guests to me that I never would have thought to interview. And most of them, I would say like 99.99% of them have been incredible.
That's amazing. And the question selfishly that I have is, what advice do you have for me or for any other podcasters? And it doesn't have to be podcast specific, but it could be for folks that are in the early stages trying to figure it out.
Oh, I have so much advice for you. I think you got to keep following the breadcrumbs of the stories that excite you. Because if you're bored while you're listening, your audience is bored. Like, that's the biggest piece of advice. Like, keep creating good. You seem really interested and you did your homework. Like, that was awesome. Not everybody does that. So thank you for doing that. Like, you showed up prepared. You clearly read my book. And, like, it was really nice to talk with you. So thank you. I think you got to just keep going. And you also have to decide what you want from it. Like, if you want this podcast as an entity, like, I really wanted to try business. And I interviewed all these guys who started t-shirt companies and shoe companies, and they sold it and they made all this money. And, like, you know, I'm still driving a 2007 Prius, so don't get any crazy ideas. But I wanted to start a business and sell it, like, as a practice without going to business school. And this was something that I could try. I know another guy who does, like, campfire inspired podcasts, something like that. He just loves the conversations. They bring him so much joy. He's a real estate agent. But, like, the conversations about adventure bring him so much joy, he doesn't care about the other part of it. But I think you need to ask yourself, why are you doing this? Are you doing this because you want to have conversations, or are you doing this and are you doing this because you want to market a service to other people? And I think you can have an and, but you need to figure out your why. And stay true to who you are. Like, I tell inappropriate jokes every now and then on my podcast, and, you know, luckily the team lets most of them stay. Every now and then they got to cut one. But I think being authentic is important.
I agree. And I definitely will meditate on that question. I think I've asked myself that many times, and I think the one undertone that I always have of podcasting is the way I have it set up now is I get to be completely selfish. I only have to talk to who I want to talk to as often as I want to talk to them for as long as I want to talk to them. And I get to pick the questions because they're things that I'm interested in. There's, like, no ulterior motive. There's nothing else going on except for my own curiosity. And I would hate for that to be tarnished in any way.
I love that. You know, for me, journalism was a door to curiosity, to, like, ask people that I wouldn't necessarily be in the same room with big questions. And I think that's the cool thing about podcasting is, like, anybody can get anyone in a room and ask them the questions they want to ask. So yeah, it's a curiosity fulfiller and a connector to so many other people. Like, I think the one weird thing about podcasting that I wish I could change is, like, you have no idea who's listening to you, and you have no idea how it resonates with them unless they physically write you an email or an Instagram message. You will never know how it affects someone else. So that's what I'm saying. Like, if you're bored, somebody else is probably going to be bored too. But I really want to do more in-person events. Like, I love, like you said, we all are craving community. We're, like, curious community creatures. Like, we need each other. We need friends. And I've been podcasting for a long time. So any chance I get to do in-person talks or in-person panels or in-person events, I'm like, hell yes.
All right. Well, next time you're in Colorado, come over and do an in-person interview in the studio, and we'll make it happen.
I think even better, we should do an event and invite your listeners and my listeners to come meet us at, like, a bar, like a field, I don't know, a coffee shop, whatever, okay, and do a chat. I think it would be really fun.
Yeah, I love that. Speaking on that, what do you have anything, like, on the horizon that people should look out for, something that is scary and exciting?
I'm going to my first wave pool in 2 weeks. I've never surfed a wave pool.
Wow.
I'm
jealous.
And, you know, I'm like, I really like nature. This isn't nature, but it is kind of a gateway to nature because it simulates surfing and gets a lot of people outside, even though it's man-made. Like, I don't know yet. Like, I'm really curious to see how I'll enjoy it or not.
So
So
for
I have
people
that.
that don't know anything about surfing, a wave pool is the treadmill of surfing. It essentially spits out the perfect wave over and over and over again, and you're in the right position. All you've got to do is the running on the treadmill, which is the surfing.
Apparently, it's like very different than an actual wave, the one I'm going to, and I don't think there's a barrel section, but should be interesting. And then after that, I'm going to the New York Marathon, and I'm going to be hosting a panel for REI, and I get to do in-person events and talk
Wow.
to people live. So that's going to be really cool. I really want to run the marathon, but I don't have an entry, so I don't think that's going to happen. But I'm hoping to do a distance run, and I was injured for a while, and I'm just getting back into running, so. Yeah, there's this Friday, there's a group of girls coming to Encinitas and they're running 100 miles from San Diego to Los Angeles to raise money for MS, and they're super cool. And then they're going to run the New York Marathon, but I'm going to go out and run a few miles with them to start. So I like people doing wild ideas. I want to be part of them. I want to cheer them on. And I want you to go do a wild idea too, because I think it'll change your life. What's your next wild adventure?
Oh man, that's a good question. I just got done with Leadville 100. Well, not just got done, but that was
That's
recently.
huge. I saw that.
Yeah, that was.
Congrats.
Thank you. It was a
Wait,
doozy
what's
because
Space Camp? Does that really exist?
Space Camp does exist. That is a real thing.
Someone
I
was
actually
telling me
didn't.
about that, and I was like, "Oh my God, that sounds hilarious and amazing."
I didn't know about Space Camp, and I was feeling pretty rough. It's like 86 miles in or something, or yeah, something like that. 80 miles in, and I come up on top of this hill. We actually talked about this on a podcast recently. You get on top of this hill, and all of a sudden, it feels like you're at Electric Forest. It's like everyone is just high on mushrooms and acid, and you walk up to the table where they have like, ultra snacks, and there's just like bottles of whiskey, and yeah, it's a completely off the books quote unquote aid station where people set up like this psychedelic forest and just party all night. Pretty
And like the
wild.
last thing you want after 86 miles is like to take a hit or do a mushroom, but people are
I
doing them for you apparently.
Yeah, and they put the whiskey like on the table with like shots as if I was gonna just walk up and be like, you know what I need right now is to get hammered drunk on straight tequila or whiskey. But yeah, I did not partake. I normally would have been more in awe of what was going on there because I love to get weird and I love like weird ththings, but I
You're at
couldn't
mile
handle it
86,
mentally.
dude. Yeah, I think that is so funny. I didn't even know that existed. It would be fun to like go be a spectator that hadn't ran 86 miles and showed up to Space Camp.
I would like, yeah, I was gonna say I'd like to. You just go up like Sugarloaf Mountain, so I would love to go up there. It would just be a fun night with friends and just to experience it. You could do a podcast up there. Can you imagine the conversations you would have? Like it'd be
It's gonna
incredible.
have to be a separate podcast than the one I do for REI, but yes, that's a fun
Well,
podcast. Let's do
here's
it.
the thing, Shelby. There's no rules on this podcast, so this podcast we can put up whoever and whatever conversations we want.
That sounds really fun. Well, it was a joy to talk to you. Thank you so much
Gosh,
for inviting me. I don't know how you found me, but I appreciate it. And if I can ever help you in anything, like I'll give you my number, I'll DM you, and don't feel free to reach out.
absolutely. Yeah, this was a blast. Your story is inspiring. Your podcast is inspiring. Your book is inspiring.
Thank
Real
you.
quick, people that are looking to find you, where can they find more Shelby Stanger?
Oh, I'm like way visible. ShelbyStanger.com. On Instagram, I'm at Shelby Stanger. And then the book, Will to Wild Adventures Great and Small to Change Your Life, is on Amazon at REI or wherever books are sold.
Right on, Shelby. Well, thanks guys for listening, and until next time, stay wild.
Thanks, Ryan.